welcome all. Thanks all for coming. And it's great to be sat with Matt, to be able to talk through the whole journey, I suspect might be, or something we could try to get to in this. But I certainly feel that part of my journey started through having known you and having been a writer as well for Frieze magazine in its earliest days. So it's funny to get the call that Tim's unwell and I have to run down and interview, as it were, the old boss. But I just wanted to ask you right from the word go, if you could just give a little summary about Frieze Art Fair now. How many people are attending Frieze Art Fair over the 4 days?
Yeah, it's about 63,000.
And that's gone up from, I think there was, sorry to be so statistical at first, but it went up, it's been going up since about 40,000 in the first year.
So the first started in 2003.
Yeah.
And I think we had 26,000 the first year. So it went up gradually till about 2006, when I think it reached 68,000. And at that point we decided it was actually too busy. People were complaining that they were,
it was victimized.
There were too many people that couldn't see the art. So we kind of limited the ticket numbers a bit and raised the ticket prices a bit, just to kind of calm it down a bit.
So when you left university to start Frieze, did you think you would be hosting art fairs with 68,000 people coming to them over 4 days? Tell me about
the magazine. I mean, I like to say this, but I probably shouldn't boast about it. But I have no art training at all. I've never studied a day of art history or fine art. I didn't go to art school. Even when I was young, my parents might take me to museums, and I hated it. I felt I was being dragged around. I thought they were really boring. No interest in art at all, basically. My father works in music, in classical music, and he's an agent for some avant-garde classical musicians. Stockhausen was one of his artists, for instance. So I've kind of been around the avant-garde, if you like, growing up. And my dad worked for himself, so I kind of thought that was a normal-ish thing to do. And I did always love design and magazines and architecture. When I was 11, I said I wanted to be a designer, and my mum bought me a Electrocyte catalogue, and I loved that. And then I loved music when I was a teenager. Not very original, but it was absolutely, I was obsessed with it and read every page of the NME every week. And then went to university and studied psychology. And it's only after I left university with a useless psychology degree that I thought, what am I going to do? And a friend was at art school and said, oh, there's some interesting stuff going on. Do you want to go and see some exhibitions? And I had a very kind of quick journey, actually, from going to the Royal Academy and seeing a kind of Matisse Picasso show. I think it was the most amazing thing ever. I think all contemporary art was complete crap. And this must have been in '89. And at the time, there was this magazine, Modern Painters, around. Oh, it's still around, Modern Painters. But it was a very traditional magazine at the time. An art critic called Peter Fuller launched it, who was actually a kind of avant-garde writer in the 70s for Studio International, and sort of turned his back on the avant-garde and went very much into figurative British painting, and launched this magazine named after a Ruskin essay, Modern Painters. And that was quite a strong movement in Britain at the time, that they would talk about the Sorota tendency in the newspapers, and they would think, the jury was really out whether traditional figurative British art was the right thing, or whether Carl Andre's bricks were the right thing. No one, it could have gone either way. It felt like it could go either way, actually. It was a very hostile environment to anything that was, international, conceptual, contemporary as we know it, even abstract, kind of was on a territory. But things began to make a little bit of a shift in the very late 80s, early 90s, with what we now know as the YBA Goldsmith generation, which weren't really thought about at the time. But I made a personal journey, probably over about 12 months, from thinking it was all absolutely crap, because that's what I've been reading on newspapers, and thinking anything beyond, Jackson Pollock wasn't art, you know, to seeing some of the things that young artists were doing, in particular some of the warehouse shows that Damien Hirst and some of that generation were creating, and thinking, and meeting those artists. In fact, Damien was probably one of the first artists I ever met, and thinking, oh my God, these people are not pulling the wool over our eyes. They are genuinely intelligent, exciting, clever, fun, and I want to be part of this. So that was where it all started.
I mean, the landscape was very polarised then.
Yeah.
I mean, Peter Fuller died in a car accident eventually, didn't he?
Yeah.
But he was absolutely hell-bent on destroying the image or reputation of contemporary art in what was then a very thick modern paint. It was very glossy and expensive, and it led you to believe it was an absolute authority. And yet, at the same time, you had Art Scribe, which was sort of bumbling through, and oddly,
it was quite a successly Art Scribe.
Well, towards the end, oddly, it went in its last guise. It went huge.
It did,
It went from being a fairly thin magazine, but very on the ball, to suddenly a very sumptuous magazine, which went 2 issues more and sadly failed.
Exactly. So the you know, when I started to, just to bring it back to me for a second, when I started getting into contemporary art, I started buying the art magazines. I bought Flash Art and Art Forum, and Art Scribe at the time was the British art magazine. It was the only international contemporary British art magazine, based in London. It had contributors in Cologne, which was a big centre at the time, and I was reading it and thinking it was the absolute kind of authority. And I didn't feel that what we were starting would in any way compete with them, but I didn't feel they were really interested in younger artists, and that you really had to get to a certain level before you got into Art Scribe. And I also thought the language they were using was a bit too much jargon. Yeah. You know, what we tried to do in Frieze, and we don't always succeed, but we still try and do is have clear, intelligent writing. So not to dumb it down, to have the most, you know, smartest things you can say and the highest level of analysis, but in the clearest possible prose.
I think to put that into context, there was a very big drive towards writing about theory at the end of the 80s, and everything was convoluted and painful.
So this drove me absolutely nuts, because I'd studied philosophy at university, and I know how difficult philosophy is. I mean, it used to take me half an hour to read a page of philosophy to really understand it. And I would read this code philosophy that was masquerading as art criticism, and know that whoever had written it didn't understand the basic philosophy behind it. In fact, often it was the opposite of what the philosopher was trying to say, actually. They totally misread it. And there was a horrible phase in art criticism and in talking and analysing art, which I hope is not going to ever come back, where you know, artists felt that they looked clever being in the companion of clever people, which the philosophers were, and bad writers who didn't understand it thought, well, if I just drop a few names and make a few quotes and misread a few things, whoever's reading it will think I'm clever too. And it's like this. It's the real meaning of pretentiousness, you know, where you're actually, you know, pretending you're something I'm not. I mean, they were just pulling all of this stuff towards them and hoping no one noticed. And you know, galleries would commission this kind of writing as for catalogues, and it was a dark time in art criticism, in my opinion.
Can we just talk a little about the period you just described, about the late 80s and 90s warehouse shows? And I remember you once mentioned...
Is this not really boring? Hasn't everyone heard this story a million times?
Well, I'm just thinking the one about where you told me that you were offered a Damien Hirst medicine cabinet for £200. And there was a period in which... 1,000, yes.
But Damien was, you know... I mean, everyone was saying at the time, this guy's going to be something, it's probably not an artist, he's probably going to be a dealer or a curator or something, because he just had such unbelievable energy, and you know, it's just making things happen left, right, and centre. And I think he wasn't sure at the time if he'd be an artist or not, because he was the organiser of those shows. But and his work was in it, but his work actually wasn't very interesting in those shows. So it was the kind of painted boxes on the ceiling, which no one really talks about now, and there was a spot wall painting. This is before Building 1. It was only with Building 1 where he did the medicine cabinets and the sort of fly killer pieces that his work really began to take off.
But also, I mean, just to talk about the pilot issue of Frieze comes into this landscape with Damien on the cover.
Yeah.
And at that time also, interestingly, Stuart Morgan is interviewing the young artist. But when you were talking with some passion there about the importance of writing to Frieze, could you just say a little more about Stuart Morgan?
Yeah, Stuart. I mean, we both knew Stuart. And Stuart spent a lot of time at the ICA, and we were talking earlier about a talk he did, which you must make available from the archive on the web, because I still remember it. It must have been 92 or something.
This is a talk with Raymond Pettigon, Jim Shaw, and Karen Klimnick, and
Jack Pearson.
Jack Pearson.
Yeah, there was some young Americans show either here or
and he was trying to interview him, and long and short of it is that, for the most part, they completely ignored every question he asked.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely horrifying.
Yeah,
I felt very sorry for Stuart.
It was maybe
it was a difficult evening.
Worst talk he ever did. But it was incredibly, and it was electrifying actually. Because, I mean, they were all actually really interesting artists, but they were variously drugged out or psychotic or whatever, and it was incredible to watch. But anyway, Stuart was, by far the most important art critic in Britain in the 80s. He was a Welsh, small, bald, gay Welsh guy who taught literature at Brighton and spent a lot of time squatting in London in the 70s. And in 1981, he went to live in New York and ended up living with Louise Bourgeois for 2 years, and was very close to her, and when he moved back to the UK, became Art Forum's first European contributor, or contributing editor. Anyway, he was the only person, the main person in Europe for Art Forum. He was involved with ArtScribe and was editor of ArtScribe for a while. I think there was a brief interlude where Matthew Collins was editor, and then he took over again by popular request, apparently. And then fell out of ArtScribe, and when I met him, he'd been, I think he was contributing editor at magazine Contemporanea with Thomas McEverley, very briefly, but basically he was, he was not massively occupied, doing a lot of freelance writing, a little bit of curating. In fact, the first international group show that the Tate did, I think, was created by him and Francis Morris.
Rites of Passage, yeah.
In 95. He was just a total force of nature. I mean, he lived in this. Did you ever go to his flat in Elephant Castle?
No.
I mean, it's an amazing story because he was a big, big guy in the London art world, but incredibly modest person and loved hanging out with young people, and unbelievably generous. And so when I called him in probably January 1991 or the end of 1990, I had his number for months, and I knew I should call him because he was the most important art critic around, and I just couldn't bring myself to. I was too nervous, but I called him up, and I said, "Look, my name's Matthew Slotover, and I think you're starting an art magazine. I'd like to come speak to you." And he said, "Oh, okay." He said, "What are you doing today?" I said, "Nothing, nothing that's important." He said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm in Old Street." And he said, "Well, get in the tube. It's only a few stops to Elephant Castle. Come and see me now." I mean, unbelievable, really. I mean, can you imagine almost anyone saying that now? But this was, I mean, it must have been one of the, if the Art Review power list was around at the time, he would have been, in London in the top 5. And for me, doing magazine #1, and I spent the next 8 hours with him, and we just talked about it, and he could see I didn't really know what I was doing, but hopefully he could see also that my heart was in the right place. And so he was our mentor, basically. There was another guy I should mention called Tony Arafin, who was similar. So Tony, if Stuart wrote all of the art criticism in London, Tony designed all of the books and catalogues in London. So he did all the graphics for the ICA for a long time, Serpentine, Chisenhale, the Icon in Birmingham, I mean, you name it, he was doing a Third Eye Centre in Glasgow, and he was an unbelievably talented designer. He'd been an art director at City Limits, he'd been a curator at the Photographer's Gallery as well, and he was just brilliant. And so I wanted Stuart to help us edit the magazine. I wanted Tony to design it, and Tony said that I don't have time to design it, but I can help you. And we ended up sharing an office with him. And Tom Gidley was the third person with Amanda, and I founded the magazine, and Tom designed the magazine. But we did a lot of stuff with Tony, and both Tony and Stuart have now died. Very sadly, actually. Stuart, both around, both in the 2000. Stuart died in 2000, and Tony was a couple of years later, I think.
Can you just talk a little bit about the design of Frieze, because it did completely stand out when it eventually reached the books.
Well, only because the other stuff was so bad. I mean, it was, I'd been grown up in the 80s reading The Face and Blitz and those kind of magazines. They were well-designed magazines. Yeah. The art magazines were not well-designed, and I didn't feel they were well-written, and I didn't feel that the subject matter was relevant to what was going on with younger artists. So those are the three things that we wanted to change. And so, we designed it a bit like a style magazine. But also like a Brodovich magazine from the 50s. I mean, it's only normal magazine design where you have a nice big picture and you have some white space and you have good typography. I mean, every magazine should be designed like that, really. But other magazines were just kind of amateurly done, and this was maybe through cost, but Frieze was maybe the first magazine to be published through what used to be called desktop publishing, which actually meant that the typesetting was done on a Mac, because this was 91, just the beginning. We designed the first one on a 9-inch black and white screen that you pressed the mouse and it would go like that every time you wanted to move the page around, which, looking at the audience, how many of you remember those days? Not many of you, no. I mean, not to mention before the internet and email and stuff like that.
Can you just tell me a little about your relationship with the writers, with the editorial? How does it work? How does it work best?
It was kind of embarrassing to start with because they knew more than we did. So our three main writers in London were Adrian Searle, David Batchelor, who doesn't write much anymore, but is now known as an artist, and Stuart. And of course they'd been writing for sort of 10 years, and they were 10 or 15 years older than us, and we were these kids who didn't really know about editing or about magazines or about art even. And they were very nice to us. I mean, But this was our lessons in art. This is how we learnt about art, by editing these great thinkers.
You went on to meet with American writers, Sheldal, Dave Hickey.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we did a trip to New York. We always wanted it to be international. So Damien was on the cover of the first issue, and Rich Prince was on the cover of the next issue. And we wanted to signify this is not just about this small group of young artists in London. It's international in scope. It had to be. You can't write about those 10 or 15 artists every issue, for years. It just would be boring. So we did a trip to New York and actually met Gavin Brown, who was our first US editor for about 6 months. And he has a big gallery in New York now.
Well, he was an artist as well, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. He was an artist, and he was working at 303 Gallery.
Yeah.
And he'd found Rick Tiravania and that introduced him to 303, and was beginning to think about opening his own gallery. And when he did, it was a conflict, so we couldn't continue. And Collier Shaw became US editor, and we had a great 7 or 8 years with her.
And also at this point, you were invited to curate a show in Venice.
Yes.
Part of the Venice Biennale in '93.
I like to tell people that. Yeah.
Yes, it was an incredible thing. You were very young at this point, and you had a large area in the Arsenale representing British artists.
No, but it didn't have to be, but mostly it was. So, the only show I've ever created is the Venice Biennale, I'd like to say. It wasn't the Venice Biennale, it was the Arsenale. It's this long, kind of mile-long structure that forms part of the Biennale. And they used to have this, what I thought was a fantastic section called the Aperto, which was for younger artists. And after my year, they canned that idea because.
Well, not because of you. I think it went very well.
Well, I don't know. Venice is a funny place. But it was run by, they gave the Arsenale over to Flash Art, actually. Yeah, the editors of Flash Art, Helena Contefer, Giancarlo Politti, and they invited 8 people to each have a selection. It's like a slice of it. I'd never been to the Venice Biennale, and they didn't invite us out there. They just sent me the plans, and I thought the plans were clearly some mistake, because the space was a mile long by about 6 meters wide and 10 meters high, and that's not an exhibition space, So I didn't really believe it until I got there 10 days before the opening, as that was the first time I'd seen the space, and chose 8 artists, including Rick Critt and Damien Hirst and Matt Collishaw and Stephen Pippin and a few other people.
I mean, it was incredibly well received, your section. I think it seemed
to
me to have a constant crowd around it.
Really?
Yes, very much so. I think that at least because of Mother and Child, the Cow Split too, which was being shown in Venice with all the Italians, I think, who seem to enjoy the idea of this Mother and Child combination, this scene in this way.
Yeah.
But also, what was interesting was that you wrote an essay, 999. I think I just wanted to mention that in relation to your own writing. I mean,
I'm not a great writer. Yeah, that wasn't a good essay, and I'm not a good writer. I mean, I know enough about writing to know when I'm beaten, and I'm not a great art critic.
So you don't pursue that so much.
I mean, I love writing, and I love reading. I appreciate writing. I used to love editing, writing. You need to be a clever person to write.
Tell me about the Frieze Art Fair. When did it first take root?
So through the 90s, the journey. I mean, I do feel like an old timer, kind of going on about the old days. But I think it's useful to put the context in that when we started the magazine in say '91. There were maybe 5 or 6 commercial galleries in London that one would go to on a regular basis. The Tate Modern obviously didn't exist. The Tate galleries, it was hardly ever did any contemporary art shows. The ICA was pretty much the place.
Still is.
It still is. Chisenheld was quite interesting for a few years. Serpentine, I suppose. Whitechapel wasn't really doing much relevant stuff. So it was really very, very small, the art world, and there was no thought, despite the fact that Paris had an art fair, Cologne had an art fair, that London, needed or deserved an art fair in the early 90s. Everyone laughed at you. And then through the 90s, just gradually, the interest came up, and actually my theory is that a lot of it is thanks to a generation of artists who spoke directly to the public and the mass media, and created more of a national interest in contemporary art. And actually the institutions had to chase them, had to follow, because suddenly newspapers were talking about it. You can look at the Turner Prize and how that sort of followed interest rather than created interest in the early 90s. I don't think it's unfair to say, actually. So the timing is quite interesting. But so gradually art became bigger in London, and there were more galleries, more museums dedicated to contemporary art. And then around the late 90s, you began to get London became a much more international city. So I think with Blair coming in '97, it was a bit like sweeping the cobwebs away from Thatcher and looking backwards and the British class system and national pride to a kind of younger, more international, more laid back, more forward-looking kind of attitudes. That's how I felt anyway. And Wallpaper magazine came out and people started painting their houses white rather than deep kind of colours, and the Laura Ashley kind of sofas and curtains went out, and they would have modern blinds, and this is only what had happened, in modernism, through modernism in Europe and the States for the whole of the 20th century. Britain had just been in this kind of time warp for about 80 years, where everyone thought, I remember we moved into our house in 96 and painted our walls white, and all our friends called it the White House because the walls were white. This was a remarkable thing, that we would have wooden floors and white walls. And now it's pretty commonplace. But I think this is all connected because it's about internationalism. It's about, you go to Germany or France or whatever, they've always had them. And it's just a simple thing. It's like white walls, why not? And so towards the late 90s, you had Blair come in, and you had London became a more international city. International people brought their habits with them, and one of their habits was collecting art, which was not a terribly British thing to do, certainly collecting contemporary art. And so suddenly, from an era when people would say there were no collectors in London, well, there's 2 or 3, including Charles Searchy, people would begin to say, actually, there are some collectors in London. So it was around the late 90s. We would hear from about 95, 96, this person's going to do an art fair in London, and we just think, fantastic, that would be great. It would be really great, because we used to love art fairs. We were not involved with collectors or the market or buying art or how it was bought. I didn't know any collectors. But we would go to art fairs as a way of finding out about contemporary art. That was, I remember we did a trip to Cologne, didn't we?
Indeed.
That?
Matt drove a car packed with magazines, myself, 3 other writers, and we drove to Cologne to participate in what was then the Unfair.
Yeah, that's right. And because flights there was no EasyJet there. It was expensive flights.
But that was an incredibly vibrant fair as well. I think we're very fortunate to have seen that because it had a lot of artists were going and putting on projects within. There was what was the big fair, which was in the Messerhalle, which was all very bright white and well lit. And then you had the Unfair, which would been put together by a group of local gallerists, young galleries who needed an alternative. Hence the name.
Young galleries included.
At the
Maureen
time.
Paley and Jay Joplin, and
303 Gallery, Gavin Brown Enterprise, Cabinet Gallery. It was quite a scene in a sense. I think everyone was finding out about each other at that moment as well.
They were very serious young galleries. They were clearly going places. And so we went there. People like us would go there to find out about art, right? And that was the place you found out about art because it wasn't really in the museums. It was in the commercial galleries. And it was in international commercial galleries. So where do you go to see a lot of international commercial galleries? You go to art fairs. So it wasn't about the market at all. And in fact, in those days, galleries were not really selling anything at art fairs either. This is 93 or something, wasn't it? This is the depth of the recession where galleries could do an art fair without selling a single piece, and they wouldn't be surprised about it because it was about just going out there and meeting people. And this is always mine and Amanda's view of art fairs, not as this kind of bonfire of vanities that is sometimes characterised at the moment, but as places to look at the latest art that was being made. And that's always been my feeling about art fairs. And so, when we began, that's why we thought it would be good for London to have an art fair, just so that people could see what was going on around the world. And that was the impetus for us to start it.
So tell me, what was going on in your mind in the first hour of the first day of the first Frieze Art Fair?
Well, I had a nightmare the night before, and it was a very vivid nightmare, that I showed up to the fair about a few hours before it started, and there was a tent in a park, but it wasn't a tent like we have, it was a big top circus tent. And it was grass.
They'd ordered the wrong one.
Yeah, they'd ordered the wrong one. And there was some guy in the corner trying to build a few walls, but there was grass all over the ground, it was kind of dark. I think there might have been horses. and I walked out and said, "What's going on? There's not supposed to be this kind of tent. There's supposed to be walls here. They're all coming in a few hours." And it was my most vivid anxiety dream. Because I hadn't really, people had done fairs and tents abroad actually, but not in London and not to that scale. And we did have some problems with the walls the first year. So believe it or not, one of the most important people say, what does it take to create a successful art fair? and I say, get the walls up in the right places, because that's kind of 80% of it. Because the galleries do the rest of the work. We take credit for it, but actually the galleries bring the art. They hang the art, they man the stands. It's their show, really. What we're just putting the walls up. And we were late getting the walls up. A third of the walls were not up the first day the galleries were moving in, and we got screamed at a bit.
I mean, you were a very brave man, because I remember one year, it's been open a few years by now, was the torrential rain came down in the very first hour, which is when all the real key business is done with the VIPs. So all you could hear was rain on a skin-tight tent. So it was like being inside a drum.
Yeah.
And I remember having to shout, "I can give you 10%
Really?
discount," and stuff. And you're trying to do deals in this cacophony of sound. But it clearly went well. I mean, Frieze is an enormous success. But also it's brought some interesting things that have occurred around it. First year, or early on, correct me if I'm wrong, there was the idea that the Tate might have money to acquire works. And I think that was quite an unusual, or certainly a first of sorts.
I think so. I mean, it's we met Castagliana from Outset, and were talking. They were just launching this organisation that was for private collectors to support public institutions, so we were launching at the same time as they were, and they were saying, well, let's do something together, and we banged around a few ideas. And one of them was, well, selfishly, what do we want? We want the galleries to sell art. Where's the best place for them to sell to the National Collection? The Tate. The Tate doesn't have any money. Its acquisition budget is very small compared to compared to its international rivals, I would say.
Right.
You were at the Tate, right?
Well, I was involved in the first discussions, and I think it was very beneficial to have Outset meet with Tate and yourselves, and the three get together to acquire work early on while it was affordable, rather than wait 5 or 6 years to find out that it was 4 times expensive and out of reach.
I mean, that was something we felt had gone wrong with the Tate's acquisition policy, that they might have £500,000 and buy one Baselitz painting, when they could have bought, Rachel Whiteley's Ghost and Damien Hirst's 1,000 Years. And Nick would admit it now, but at the time it wasn't obvious, because really the young artists were not taken that seriously. It would have been out of keeping for a museum to acquire work by very young artists. It didn't feel like the right thing. And there was this whole anti-contemporary art climate in the press. So how do you justify, saying, well, I think this is important, and we're going to acquire it with taxpayers' money. So things. But the Tate clearly missed out on a whole generation that Charles Search kind of swooped in and got instead. And we felt, well, it's a modest amount of money that we're raising. It's about £100,000. The point is not to buy one piece by a well-known artist. The point is to buy 10 pieces by young artists, and that was clearly the remit. Which I think has worked really well. So I think over the last 8 years, it's raised almost £1 million, bought over 80 works by over 60 artists. Some of which are much better known now than they were when they were bought, and some of which are really significant works. And I think it's made a little dent in the Tate's collection, which I'm really proud of.
Tell me a little bit about the Art Fair commissions as well.
Yeah. So that was, I mean, when we conceived doing an art fair, we thought, we actually thought art fairs are interesting, but they had a very bad reputation at the time. People thought of them, and maybe they still do, but people thought of them as, pretty dull trade commercial events. And we thought, how can they have more of a sort of festival feel to them? What can we do differently? So the 2 or 3 things that we did were the fun. We did it in a tent in a park, but always used an architect to try and make it look interesting. And the biggest thing, I think, probably is that we launched this commissions, because we wanted artists to feel this was a place where you could make art and make special works. And that actually the audience coming to the fair was a quite special audience, and might be people who didn't go and see art on a regular basis. And they should know that there's something about art that's not just buying and selling things in gallery stands. So for a number of reasons we thought it was an interesting thing to do. And so the first person we hired actually on the fair was Polly Staple, who's our curator, who kind of noticed it was very kind of promising, and asked us to start developing a public programme of talks, but also commissions by artists. And the first year, the most prominent one in the first year was Paolo Peavy's Grass Slope. And I could talk all day about different commissions. It's one of the best things, for me, one of the most fulfilling things about doing the fair.
Coming to the end of this talk, just to say, I mean, just tell me, what do you think Frieze has achieved? What's it done since its inception?
Not for me to say.
But what's your you talk about it helping young artists, giving young artists a voice. Is there anything that you would sort of, on your desert island discs, as it were, would you take away as knowing that Frieze has made a massive change to that?
Yeah, I mean, I vividly remember, the early days that we were talking about when I didn't know anything about art and I needed information and I needed access, and I hope it's contributed to more people's understanding of contemporary art. I think what living artists make is incredibly life-enhancing, and if it can be made part of your life, to be challenged by artists, it can really change the way you think and live. And I think often artists are at their most challenging when they're at an early stage in their career. Sometimes at a very late stage in their career as well. But if you look at the trajectory, people are really fighting against the status quo when they're young often, and then they kind of become the status quo, and that's another issue that they have to deal with. And that for me is the most interesting part. I like being challenged personally, and I think artists really challenge you. And so to help that excitement, I mean, I genuinely believe artists move culture forward, and are kind of on the bleeding edge, probably more than any other art form right now. And they deserve the platform that they have got now. And so if we help them gain a bit of that platform, then I'll be very proud.
Very good. I just want to say quickly that the next talk in the series is going to be Charlie Atlas talking with Stuart Comer. But for now, thank you very much, Matthew.
You're welcome.
It's been great.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.